Okay, so here is our last unit in AP Bio, Unit 8, Ecology. And so our first couple standards or essential knowledges start with a discussion of organisms and how they respond to their environment. Now for this, there's not really a direct thing to teach. It's not like a pathway or something, but rather just different examples. So in plants, that might be phototropism, where they grow towards the light, or photoperiodism, where they bloom depending on if it's a long day, like lots of light, or a short day plant with the sun sets earlier, like in wintertime. We have things like hibernation or brumation, I think it's called if you're a reptile. You have circadian rhythms with like syncing your gene expression and your hormone levels to the rise and set of the sun. We have changes in gene expression with, for example, fur color in animals that live in the Arctic. And so this, you could have a variety of questions actually that might come up from this. It's a pretty vague or general topic. Now, the next standard talks about organisms exchanging information with one another in response to internal changes and external cues, which can then change behavior. So the example I chose was pheromones. So we actually can communicate with chemical cues that come off of us that can then send information to nearby individuals, which will then change their internal conditions. So for example, it may be involved in mating. Certain pheromones released from like one sex can then influence reproduction in the other sex or of the species, so like with male or female fish here. We also have things called alarm pheromones. So if you have, like in the picture on the left, the little mouse that's in danger is going to actually release some pheromones that nearby mouse or mice can detect, and then that will alert them and put them into a fight or flight response. So I feel like exchanging information could be pheromones, but it could also be alarm calls or other types of communication. So animals can communicate, or organisms can communicate in different ways. We have visual, so that would be things like the fireflies lighting up, or when a dog has its hair stand up on the back of its neck, or when like humans blush. That's all like visual communication. We have auditory, so with whales singing or howling. Tactile is like touch. So for example, when baboons groom each other, that's going to be a sign of affection. And then you have chemical, which is kind of like those pheromones I just talked about, or like scent. And now ants will use pheromones for marking the trail. You also have pheromones are really used too in bees. Like with male bees, the female will release certain pheromones that will actually alter gene expression in bees around her. So different ways that we can communicate and act on it. Now, when we talk about, oops, let me go back. So communication, though, has a variety of mechanisms. So you have signaling behaviors that can produce changes in the behavior of other organisms. So here you have like two wolves, maybe like being submissive or not. And then we also have visual, audible, tactile, electrical, and chemical signals that can be used to indicate dominance, find food, establish territory, and ensure reproductive success. So I feel like here there's a wide range of things that could be asked about. Now, responses, though, to information and communication are vital to natural selection and evolution. So if a species is unable to communicate or respond to signals that may lower their fitness, and therefore those types of communication and learned behaviors can be selected for or against. So here I have like these little ducklings. They actually will imprint on their mother, and so when they hatch, they will like stick with their mother. And that's like an innate behavior. And think about it, any little duckling that doesn't have that behavior, that innate attachment to the mother, will have low fitness. It won't be protected. It won't be guided. Won't survive. Same thing with the sea turtles. The sea turtles, they have this innate, once they hatch, they see the light, and their behavior is to move towards the ocean. And if they don't, then they don't survive. And so Actually, right now, when we have artificial city lights near beaches where there's sea turtles hatching, sometimes they'll confuse the city lights for moonlight, and they'll actually go towards the streets. And so that's how we know that it is innate. We also have, like here in this goose, it's called a fixed action pattern, where if the egg rolls out of the nest, the goose, once it starts this behavior of egg rolling and returning the egg to the nest, it actually has to finish the behavior. Like, it can't stop halfway. So even if she sees the hand remove the egg, she will finish the behavior. And that's a behavior that's innate and hardwired into the neurons. And for mother geese that don't do this behavior and their egg rolls out of the nest, their babies have a less chance of survival, so it's low fitness. Now, other examples would be used in behavior for reproduction. So on the left here, I think it's a cuttlefish that does these intricate designs to attract their mates. You have the other three are all bird behaviors for courtship rituals, and any birds that don't have these innate instinctual drives to attract the opposite sex would have low fitness because they won't get to reproduce. Now, we also have things called cooperative behavior, and in cooperative behavior, that tends to increase the fitness of the individual and the survival of the whole species. So or the whole population. If you look at the picture on the right, how the wolves will work together to take down their prey. So that cooperative behavior increases their own individual fitness because by working together, they have a source of food. It also helps for the whole survival of the population. Okay. Then we have, let's go ahead and break this down a little bit. So here, we talk about energy. So there's different strategies that organisms have. You can either be an endotherm or an ectotherm. And endotherms are going to use thermal or heat energy to maintain a constant body temperature in homeostasis. So where do they get that heat? It's through metabolism. So by doing cellular respiration and breaking your food down in your mitochondria, that generates heat, and that heat is going to be used to maintain homeostasis. So if you look at this pie chart here, if you look at a male penguin that is 4 kilograms, and then a ball python that is also 4 kilograms, and you look at the amount of calories they require per year, the penguin is requiring over 300,000 kilocalories per year, whilst a python is only 8,000. Now you see in the two species, the different ones though, thermoregulation, the orange part is where the energy, those calories are going towards. So you can imagine a male penguin in the cold is going to require lots of calories to generate heat. Now, if you look at that little deer mouse, though, and you see a lot of its calories are going towards thermoregulation. This ties into Unit 2 with surface area to volume ratios. That little mouse has a very large surface area compared to its volume, so it loses a lot of heat to its environment and therefore needs to have a higher metabolic rate, designating more of its calories towards thermoregulation to make up for the heat that's lost to the environment. Now, the penguin, though, has insulation. It has fat, and it has, feathers. It's going to insulate and trap a lot of that heat for it. Now, you can look at this graph over here on the left with the bobcat and the snake. You can see how the bobcat's body temperature stays pretty constant no matter what the ambient or outside temperature is. Compared to the reptile is going to have its body temperature is dependent on the outside temperature. Okay. Now, when we look at reproductive strategies, okay, so we have two kinds of species, really. You have R and K, well, not just two kinds, but we classify them as either R or K selected species, and really that comes down to their strategy for reproduction. Now, this does tie into carrying capacity, though. So let's look at the graph on the left first. And so here we have, if you think about little r stands for rate of growth, or growth rate. So in exponential growth, you have a pretty high growth rate at that bottom part of the graph. And so that's where cockroaches in this graph would be an R-selected species. Their strategy for reproduction is to put a lot of their energy towards making tons of offspring. In our selected species, they make tons of offspring with the hopes that a few will survive. And that's where you see in the top right graph right here, this blue line, how you read this R selected species as a type 3 survivorship curve is that they have, if you look at the thing, so this is number of survivors. So if you start at 1,000, they don't have many survivors. Very few actually survive to old age, to the 100% of the maximum lifespan. So their strategy in life is to just produce a whole lot of offspring and hope a few survive to adulthood, versus a K-selected species. A K-selected species, their population probably already lives near carrying capacity. So if you are a species living near carrying capacity, and K is the little letter for carrying capacity, that's why these are K-selected species. K-selected species live at or near carrying capacity, and it's already tough to survive. There's already limited resources and density-dependent limiting factors. So therefore, their strategy that has evolved is to have few offspring, but lots of parental care. So it comes down to, where are these organisms putting their energy? Our selected organisms are putting their energy towards producing lots of gametes and offspring, but little to no parental care. Versus K-selected species are putting their energy towards raising their young. They have few offspring, but the chance of their few offspring surviving to old age is high. So as a human, I have 2 offspring and I'm raising them for many years, hoping to ensure their survival to old age. So that is where I put my energy and my resources as a K-selected species. Now, if you look at the survivorship curve up here in the type 2, the chance of mortality is even at any age. So that isn't really an R or a K-selected species. All right, so now when we look at, this is tying in that metabolic rate that I talked about earlier with the mouse, how the mouse had a very high metabolic rate, and that's because the energy we take in as endotherms is going to be used to generate heat. So we lose heat to our environment. That's part of our evaporative cooling. But that's not good if it's really cold outside and you're losing your heat to the environment. So you can see this graph, how the surface area to volume ratio of the organism matters when it comes to calculating their metabolic rate and how many calories they're going to have to burn through to generate heat. So the smaller the organism, so the less volume, but the more surface area compared to that volume, the higher the metabolic rate compared to an animal like an elephant who has a larger volume compared to its surface area. So the surface area to volume ratio is not as great. A lot of their heat is going to be trapped on the inside and not lost to the environment, and so they would have a smaller metabolic rate. Now, also elephants, just to talk about evaporative cooling, those large flat ears are to increase surface area to have heat evaporate for cooling off. All right, now if we look at this next one about energy, so a net gain in energy results in energy storage or growth of an organism, but a loss in energy results in loss of mass or ultimately death of an organism. I think that's kind of like hopefully a common sense standard. Okay, and then we look at changes in energy availability can result in changes in population size. So I chose the predator-prey relationship graph to explain this standard, because when we think about changes in energy availability, if you are the predator, your prey is your available energy. So if we look at the lynx is orange here. So if you look at let's go to 1870. You can see, look at 1865, and let's look at the prey, the hare, which is a rabbit. So after 1865, you see a decrease in the hare population. Now that's food for the lynx, so the predator. So if the hare or the rabbit population decreases, it follows that the lynx are going to start to starve and not have a lot of food, so their population size declines. So that is why you see a little bit of a lag time a little bit later, that orange line around 1968 or so starts to decline. Now, once the lynx population goes down, though, the predator and the prey population increases. That will be followed by an increase in the predator because now they have energy available to them. this also can be tied into producers and different trophic levels. So when you look at an ecosystem or a community, really its structure is going to be dependent on the energy that's available in the producers. So the producers you have at the bottom, if there's a drought and the rain doesn't fall and the crops die, or if there's like a lot of volcanic eruptions or air pollution and the sunlight is blocked and the crops can't do photosynthesis, so you have a decrease in photosynthetic activity, well, then you have a decrease in available food or available energy. So if that bottom trophic level decreases, it follows that the trophic levels above will also decrease. But in the opposite, if you have, like in Southern California here, we have El Niños periodically, where we're going to have lots of rain over our winter time. So if we have lots of rain and we have lots of plant growth, we have these things called super blooms. Then if you have lots of producer activity, lots of growth, well, now you can support more herbivores and therefore more secondary consumers, etc. So there we go. Now, when we talk about energy in an ecosystem, we have two sources. We have photosynthesis, but there's also something called chemiosynthetic organisms or chemiosynthesis, which is going to be like at the bottom of our ocean near hydrothermal vents, because we really just don't have sun reaching miles and miles down to the bottom of the ocean. So therefore, they need a different source to start basically like that Calvin cycle and that building of organic molecules. And so that source is going to be from the hydrogen sulfide and the chemicals coming up from the hydrothermal vents. All right, so now that's autotrophs. We have two kinds, photosynthetic organisms like plants, algae, protists, phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, but then you also have chemiosynthetic organisms that you would find in the bottom of the oceans. Now heterotrophs, though, they need to eat to get their energy, so we cannot do photosynthesis. And really, when we think about heterotrophs, we get our energy, okay, in Unit 3, on cellular respiration, we talk a lot about breaking down glucose and carbohydrates. But in reality, we can also use lipids as well as amino acids or protein for our energy sources. The macromolecules basically can enter in different steps in the cellular respiration pathways. So glycolysis would start with glucose, but if you're breaking down fatty acids, you would just start right at the Krebs cycle in aerobic respiration. Now, amino acids have bonds to be broken as well. And so some amino acids can like cut in line in the glycolysis pathway. And then other amino acids can start in the citric acid cycle. But really, we're trying to get those electrons for the electron carriers for oxidative phosphorylation. Okay. Now, let's go on to populations. So in populations, they are made of individuals that interact with one another and their environment. So I think it's kind of beautiful to think about a population. In population ecology, we talk about how biotic and abiotic factors can influence density, distribution, and size of a population. And really, these members in the same population, so a population is defined as the same species in a designated area. And these members in that population are going to compete with each other for resources. They're experiencing the same abiotic as well as biotic factors, and they're likely to interact and breed together. And so this is also where when you have that struggle for resources in a population, especially as density-dependent limiting factors come into play, you're going to have the consequences of natural selection. In a population, not all are going to survive. So as they struggle to live together and compete against each other, you'll have natural selection and survival of the fittest driving possibly the evolution of this species. Okay, so when we talk about populations and how they grow, we have two models. We have the exponential growth model as well as the logistic growth model. And in exponential growth, this population is going to grow as if there's unlimited resources. So it's going to grow exponentially, and the formula is R, which is rate of growth, times capital N. Capital N stands for population size. So in exponential growth, it's growing as if there's unlimited resources and limiting factors aren't an issue. Now, you will find exponential growth in situations like following a forest fire or something, like all of a sudden this habitat has been cleared, now there's like room for exponential growth. But in reality, a population will reach a density that becomes unsustainable. So as you are growing exponentially, eventually resources are going to become limited. There's going to be a fight. There's going to be competition. There's going to be a challenge to survive. So right now, the human population, we are growing exponentially, and eventually we will experience an overshoot. Some people, some scientists predict or question, are we already past our carrying capacity? Are we still not there yet? So when we think about population density, that is how many individuals there are per unit area. And as our population density increases, I love this. As the population grows, the competition for resources becomes very great. And if you go above carrying capacity, not all members are going to survive. So what we call that part is the overshoot, and then you'll have a dip, and then they'll survive, and then, too many, and back and forth. And eventually that average is called the carrying capacity, and that is how many individuals that can be supported in a given area. And so as a population, though, grows exponentially, logically, they're going to reach a limit. And so we call this type of growth logistic growth. And that involves carrying capacity. So if you're doing math for this, we're looking at the rate of growth and the population size, but we also take into consideration that there's a limit and there's going to be like a slowing down. So this is the part I find super fascinating. Let me see if I can write on this for you. So right around here, the rate of growth slows down because not all individuals are surviving that are born. And then right around here, when it's flat, the number of births and the number of deaths are equal. The rate of growth is 0 when you reach carrying capacity. Okay, let me erase this. Okay. Now, when we talk about why a population would reach carrying capacity, though, that is where we have things called limiting factors. And we have density-dependent limiting factors as well as density-independent limiting factors. Density-independent would be things like natural disasters, right? Like it doesn't matter your density. If there's a forest fire or a flood, individuals are going to be limited on how much they can grow. There's going to be death. However, in population density limiting factors, density dependent, think about as the population grows, any factor or anything that's going to make it harder to survive, we call that a density dependent. So as the density increases, disease is going to spread a lot easier. So I'm recording this in 2021 after we've lived through COVID and a pandemic, and this is why we have social distancing, because when we're really close, disease can spread really easy. So that is a density dependent limiting factor. We also have predation. So the more individuals in a population, the easier predators are going to have at getting food. So that'll keep the population in check. And then competition between each other. As population size increases exponentially, you're going to have individuals of the same species competing for the same resources because populations live in the same area. So there's going to be a limited amount of food, space, shelter, water, nutrients in the soil, sunlight. There's going to be competition for available resources. And as the population approaches carrying capacity, that competition will get more fierce and there'll be a greater struggle for survival, which is where natural selection comes into play. Okay, so now we're switching gears and kind of moving into, oops, I'm still on a pen, as we're going to move into community. And so when we talk about, populations are individuals of the same species breeding and interacting together in an area. Versus a community is all the different populations interacting together. But we can actually talk about the structure of a community and talk about its resiliency and how healthy that community is. All right, so let's talk about this. So here, if I have species diversity, so that's all the different species that are within a community. You have what's called species richness, which are the number of different species in a community, as well as relative abundance, which is what's their proportion within that community. So let's go ahead and look at 2 examples here. So here we have community A and community B. And we can see here that the species richness is the same. In both communities here, there are 4 species of trees. However, their relative abundance is different. In this one on the left, I made it where it's all equal. They're evenly dispersed. Whereas the one on the right is made up of majority this like oak-looking tree. So when we talk about why this matters is let's pretend there's an invasive species. And this invasive species is all through the west coast of the United States. It's called a bark beetle. And this bark beetle actually gets inside of trees and eats the bark or the tree from the inside out, killing it. So let's say it attacks this particular tree. Well, in both communities, if that tree were to die off, you can see how community A is more resilient and not as greatly affected because they had a greater relative abundance of different variety of species. And so therefore, when you have an ecosystem or a community made majority of just one species, it's less resilient to things like invasive species, viruses, pests, humans, etc. And so the more variety you can have, the greater genetic and species diversity you can have within a community, the more resilient it's going to be to change. Okay, but communities can change over time depending on how different populations interact. So a community are the different populations living together and interacting together. So you can think about like in a food web, how if like the number of foxes for some reason like greatly increases, then the amount of mice and rabbits will decrease. Like their numbers are all dependent on each other. Or earlier we talked about like predator-prey relationships. But this would also tie into like keystone species and trophic cascades, and really keeping in mind that all species do interact together and they influence each other. Okay, and so interactions among or between these populations determine how they access energy and matter within a community. So energy and matter is really coming down to food if you are a heterotroph. So that could be like competition, it could be predators, but really when we think about plants, their matter and energy is photosynthesis. And so they have competition in their own roots, or if one plant grows above the other and puts shade on that next one. So there's actually